Good day to you all. I am Jim Levitt. I'm the director of the International Land Conservation Network, and I will serve as moderator for today's very interesting session. Right now, I am sitting in Kansas City in the center of the United States. I am joined by panelists from around the world. It is really remarkable what we're doing here. We have Harry Jonas, who is joining us from Malaysia. He is the Director of Future Law and the co-chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas Specialist Group on OECMs, or other effective area-based conservation measures. By Nigel Dudley, who is right now in Wales, the co-founder of Equilibrium Research and vice chair of the IUCN Thematic Group on Natural Solutions for Sustainable Development Goals. By Daniel Marnowick, sitting right now in South Africa, who is the East and Southern Africa Regional Coordinator for the IUCN Green List of Protected and Conserved Areas. By Clara Matayana Tobon, who is also on one of the relevant IUCN committees. By Tilman Disselhoff, who is my co-moderator, who will join us in just a second. Tilman is in Germany right now and is president of EuroSite, the European Land Conservation Network. By Heather Bingham, who is in Cambridge, England, I believe right now. And Heather is a program officer for the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center, which is based there. By Candace Stevens from South Africa, who is a green finance innovator and an officer of Wilderness Foundation Africa. And by Lisa McLaughlin in the outskirts of Toronto, Canada, who is a vice president of conservation policy and planning for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. In addition to that, we are joined by, right now, 117 participants. We have people registered today, and I think there may be several hundred eventually, from Costa Rica, Chile, Brazil, Belgium, Italy, Netherlands, Spain. In North America, the United States and Canada. In Asia, China and India. In Africa, Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Kenya. And in Australasia, Australia and New Zealand. This is truly a global conversation, and I'm so happy to have everyone here for this. With that, let me introduce my friend and colleague, Tilman Disselhoff of EuroSite and the European Land Conservation Network.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome to everyone around the world on behalf of EuroSite, the European Land Conservation Network. I just want to echo Jim's words to start thanking our presenters and panelists today for the time that they very generously dedicate to this event. I want to thank to you, our audience around the world, for your interest in other effective area-based conservation measures. And I want to thank the ILCN for jointly organizing this event with us today. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present this theme in today's webinar. I think it comes at the perfect time. As you know, OECMs have risen to the fore in the political arena very recently, and they have a lot of potential, but also a lot of questions about them still remain to be answered. As you probably know, the latest Protected Area Planet report was published by UNEP, WCMC, and IUCN last week, and I'm sure we can talk about that today. The report for the first time included also data on OECMs in relation to the EC target number 11, and also in parallel in the EU Biodiversity Strategy has a target to protect 30% of its land and sea base by 2030. This 30 by 30 target is also shared by other governments around the world. The EU Biodiversity Strategy explicitly refers to OECMs as one potential tool to implement this target, but it remains to be seen how that will be operationalized in the EU. So we at EuroSite strongly believe in voluntary land conservation and in the cooperation with private landowners as one strategy for effective site-based nature conservation. So we surely hope to kick off a fruitful discussion today about the potential of OECMs and to start answering some of the questions. I'm very grateful for all the expertise that we have convened in this webinar. And with that, thanks to all of you, and back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Tillman. It is remarkable what the Protected Planet report told us last week, which is that at the present count, there are 15.6% of the surface of the Earth is recorded in the WCMC database as being protected and registered. If you add the OECMs from 5 nations, only 5 nations, that number climbs to 16.6%. And there is confidence when OECMs and other protected areas from all of the nations that participate in this enterprise are counted, that the conservation community of the world will have surpassed the Aichi target of 17%, which is really a remarkable and wonderful result that I think few people expected 10 years ago. So it's a very good stepping stone to the work that we have ahead with 30 by 30. And with that, I am very pleased to introduce Harry Jonas. Harry has been really a standout advocate for OECMs and has helped to define the concept, helped to promote the concept, and is now very active in implementing OECMs around the world. So with that, Harry, please take the microphone.
Thank you very, very much, Jim. Tillman and Chandni, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Great. And thanks also to both networks for this, for the platform to bring OECMs to all of you on this call today. So I always like to begin my presentations with my kind of leading message, and that is that this new framework, other effective area-based conservation measures, represents a significant step forwards in the formal recognition of the long-term conservation of biodiversity occurring outside of protected areas. That protected areas and OECMs are complementary and support each other and help connect our landscapes. So let's go back in time, friends, all the way to the distant past, 2010, when we all congregated in Nagoya, Japan, to agree the CVD strategic plan, the last strategic plan. And as you're all aware on this call, I'm sure we agreed 20 targets there. And target 11 is the area-based target. And whilst it is the area-based target, in fact, people still refer to it as the protected areas target. And it's because there was some selective reading going on. And so you can see here, as Jim was just saying, the target here is 17% of terrestrial areas, 10% of marine areas to be achieved through or conserved through well-connected systems of protected areas. And a lot of people read it like that, understandable. And it certainly catalyzed a lot of good work on extending the protected area estate worldwide, which is vitally important. But at the same time, there was this negotiated, strange, weird, wonderful negotiated language in there around other effective area-based conservation measures. The question in 2010 and onwards was, what does this mean? Or what might this mean? Or what could this mean if we were to define this intelligently and make these words work for us as conservationists? And so it took until 2018 to develop that global definition. And I'm just going to pause and let you, all of you, read in your own time this definition. Thanks. this is where, as an international lawyer, I would like to suggest, if you haven't read international law before, or even if you haven't, you've been put off by it, likely, actually the CBD decision on protected areas and OECMs that contains this definition and the criteria for identifying OECMs is worth a read. It's worth your time. And I'll post it right after my presentation for you, so you can have a look at after this session of ours today. But as you can see here, the core elements, the area should be geographically defined. The area should not be a protected area. There should be governance and management in the area. And you can see right in the middle there, the crux of it, that these areas must achieve positive long-term outcomes for the conservation of biodiversity. And of course, bearing in mind and respecting ecosystem functions and services and cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values being critical to these areas. And so we got that definition. But whenever, presenting these ideas, generally the first question in any session like this is, well, how is that very different from what a protected area is? Because it sounds relatively similar. In my view, it's a very nuanced difference, but a very elegant complementarity between these two concepts. So protected areas are areas that are dedicated to the conservation of biodiversity as defined by the CBD and followed up by IUCN as well. These are areas whose core function is to conserve biodiversity, and they will have a management plan which contains that right at the top. And at the same time, OECMs are areas that do not necessarily have to have that conservation focus in the first instance, but they must be areas that are achieving the long-term conservation of biodiversity. And that'll make sense in the next couple of slides if it doesn't make sense yet, but I hope it does. I always think of these things as a yin-yang kind of shape, and I find these two different concepts can come together in landscapes and seascapes in very, very complementary ways. And I look forward to hearing your views on whether you agree or not. This is one way to describe this. As a spectrum of OECMs, all of these areas delivering the effective in situ conservation of biodiversity. This is not a spectrum of conservation outcomes to high conservation outcomes. They're all meeting that standard. The difference here is the intention to conserve. So right at the furthest end of the spectrum from protected areas, we've got sites that are basically no disturbance areas for one or other reason, not related to biodiversity conservation. In the first instance, sacred sites, some military areas, war graves in my home country, the UK, and other kinds of no-go areas may well be delivering conservation outcomes. Areas that are being used at very, very low levels. Indigenous and community conserved areas, some of them, some locally managed marine areas, some non-timber forest product areas, watersheds and ecosystem service related wetlands, for example, around the world, we're seeing look like, potential OECMs. I know this can confound, but there are some places as well that have a primary conservation objective, i.e. in the first instance, they are prima facie protected areas, but for one or other reason, either they cannot be recognized as protected areas because of the laws and policies in the countries in which they are found, or perhaps the governance authorities would prefer not to have their areas recognized as PAs. And in those probably very small numbers of instances, those areas might be reported as OECMs instead, and perhaps as a staging process to proper recognition as protected areas. And what I've done here for you is I've just put in protected areas within that spectrum again. So we're not talking about, separate or competing frameworks at all. They are just different ways of looking at the way we govern and manage and coexist with nature. OECMs, like, have got 4 governance types, IUCN governance types: government entities, indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as some of different forms of shared arrangements within those. This is a really important point for me personally, from where I come from in this work. That is to say that OECMs compel us to take governance very seriously, because protected areas, we talk often about establishing or designating protected areas. But OECMs, we have deliberately used the word recognizing OECMs, identifying and recognizing them. And that means we have to take the existing governance, the existing management regimes in those areas extremely seriously, because whatever they are, as diverse as they will be, they are doing something right. And so the first thing any external agencies or parties need to do is to engage and understand what those systems are before framing them or interfering in any one way. So just to summarize the first, well, the majority of my presentation actually, that is to say, in my view at least, or in IUCN's view, OECMs provide recognition, support, security, or identification, as OECMs can provide these things to diverse areas of conservation occurring and good governance occurring outside of protected areas. So some resources for you. IUCN, World Commission on Protected Areas, on the left-hand side has developed some set of guidelines to go over essentially what I've just updated you on in a lot more detail. And on the right-hand side, some work that Daniel Marnowick is keenly involved in, who's going to speak today as well. This is the site-level methodology for identifying OECMs. So this is the document that you would take and use at the local level to generate a result on whether an area actually meets this criteria for OECM. Yes, this is what Jim was referring to earlier, so it's great to give this to you in full Technicolor. So of OECMs to date, as per the Protected Planet report led by Heather, who's going to speak just now, is 506 from the following countries. You can read them on screen. I won't read those out to you. And that breaks down to circa 1.3 million square kilometers of land and about 300,000 square kilometers of marine areas. And as Jim points out in his opening remarks, that's just from these few countries. And so one scales that up over 10 years towards 2030. Speaking of which, this is my last slide for the timekeepers. This is what the draft target 2 looks like, currently being discussed by parties to the CBD at Substa. And you can see once again that the same formula is being used, at least in the middle, connecting protected areas and OECMs as the delivery mechanisms for the 30% target. So I would just close by saying something potentially controversial, and that is that I think that the 30% target will be achieved by that, if that is the target, but even if it isn't, I believe it will be achieved through protected areas and OECMs. The real challenge is not whether we will achieve 30%. The challenge is the integrity at the governance level, equity and governance, and the integrity at the conservation outcome level for those figures. Is that 30% of paper parks and paper OECMs, or is it the real deal in terms of governance and conservation outcomes? And so that is our common mission together. Thank you very much. This is our collective email if you'd like to get in touch with us. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, Harry. That was terrific. I now want to bring on Nigel Dudley. Nigel has had a very distinguished career in this area. He has authored or co-authored report after report after report on privately protected areas and helped really to define the field. So Nigel today is going to talk about OECMs in European context. And Nigel, the floor is yours.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Jim. I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation. except that I can't see my presentation. Huh, hang on one second. There you go. Can you all see that?
We can see it.
Perfect, great, thank you. So I'm going to summarize a study that Harry, myself, and a number of other people did looking at the role of OECMs in Europe, the potential role. It's a study for the European Commission, and it came out of the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center. Heather's here today, and others I see on the call from the center, and from the Institute for European Environmental Policy, which is a Brussels and London-based think tank on European policy. And the sort of background is that OECMs are currently not very well understood at all in the European context. European conservation efforts have been primarily on the Natura 2000 network, which for those outside of Europe is a European-wide conservation network that's been in place for a number of years. It's recognized that they can make a valuable contribution to the EU's environmental objectives, but there was a real gap in understanding how that might be applied and what it meant. So we were asked to do an initial scoping study to look at that. And to give you a little bit more background, that came out of recognition that there are a number of European-wide or EU-wide initiatives that were directly looking at area-based conservation. There's the Green Deal umbrella, which is a big Green New Deal proposal from the EU. There's the 2030 Biodiversity Strategy. There's a number of existing directives, the Birds and Habitats Directives, Water Framework Directive, Floods Directive, Nitrates Directives. These are European-wide regulations which seek to address environmental issues, more general issues relating to pollution control, future of agriculture. And it was recognized that OECMs could have a role in addressing a number of these, particularly EU targets for 30% of land and water to be protected by 2030. The EU Restoration Plan, which is closely linked to plans for the UN Decade for Ecological Restoration, which is launching next month, and aspects of the Green New Deal. So European Commission knew that there's a whole bunch of things that they needed to respond to and wanted to find out where OECMs might fit into that package. Now, the current study, we focused on the potential for using certain EU directives. And I think the background was that the European Commission was hoping that maybe some of the directives, land managed under a number of directives, might automatically become OECMs. They might just fulfill the criteria. We'll come to that in a minute.
Nigel, this is Jim. Could you put your slides into presentation mode?
Okay, thank you. Sorry, everyone. Okay, so for the current study, we focused on the potential use of certain EU directives. And as I said, there was a kind of hope that they might just become an automatic, they might equate to OECMs. And we built on case studies from Finland, from Spain, and then to a much lesser extent from Bulgaria. Next slide. Next, yeah. And the general message from this presentation is that indeed some existing EU directives have the potential to result in land and water management that fulfills the criteria of OECMs, but it's more complicated than it looks at first sight. It wasn't the magic bullet that the European Commission, I think, sort of secretly hoped it might be, but it could provide EU member states with a way to much more efficiently identify potential OECMs. Next slide. And we looked in particular at two directives, the Water Framework Directive, which is a broad-reaching directive that is looking at water management throughout the European Union, and the Floods Directive, which is looking much more narrowly at control of floods and how we control floods and how floods, particularly how floods impact across national borders. both falling, and they were both part of our preliminary analysis. As I say, OECMs have the potential for recognizing that OECMs have the potential to be recognized under both these directives. Next slide. So we looked at two countries, Spain and Finland, quite different political systems, quite different histories with the European Union, and consultants within country did those studies. In Spain, we had an academic, a private consultant working closely with the government, and he looked at a number of potential sites marked on the map here, 3 relating to the Water Framework Directive and 1 relating to the Floods Directive, 3 river reserves, which fell under the Water Framework Directive. All of them met the criteria of potential OECMs. However, the areas of potential significant flood risk, the ones that fell under the the Flood Directive, they felt weren't closely aligned with OECM criteria. I'll come back to why that was in a little bit. That didn't mean it was automatic. Challenges included a general lack of knowledge about OECMs among Spanish decision makers. People didn't really know how they might be used. There was a lot of suspicion, I think it's fair to say, about what they might entail for landowners and people that either owned or managed land within them. There was uncertainty about the OECM recognition process in particular, and what you'd have to do and what it was cutting you into, and concerns about possible unintended socioeconomic consequences of recognizing OECMs. Landowners were saying, does that mean we suddenly won't be allowed to do things we're allowed to do at the moment? Are we going to lock ourselves into lots of extra costs? Next slide. Then in Finland, and there's people involved in the study on the call, if people have particular questions, almost 1/10 of Finland is water. So it's got a lot of water, the country of lakes and rivers, and the Finnish study looked at 4 different water bodies, very different types of water bodies. They looked at a large lake that was partly within a Natura 2000 site, partly a protected area, and they found that the area outside was a very significant potential OECM. It could be quite an obvious change. Looked at a smaller lake, and it might have had the potential, but it didn't have enough biodiversity data to be sure. And that's a good general conclusion, that not only do you need to identify areas, you also need to know about them. You need to know whether they have enough biodiversity. You need to be able to monitor that. In that case, they didn't. Marine site would benefit if biodiversity values were more effectively integrated into the River Basin Management Plan, and they felt that also the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, another EU directive, might be a way of bringing that area in. And then a river system which fell under the Flood Directive. Unlike Spain, they felt it could be an OECM, but they weren't sure what additional conservation benefits there would be from that. Next slide, please. So the general conclusion was the assessment of sites were that there's no one directive that fulfills everything. Sites will have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. It's unlikely that all the sites within any one directive would meet all the criteria. Next slide. There's a number of reasons for that. EU member states differ in the degree within which they include biodiversity considerations within the directives. Directives are often quite general, and so the way that countries have chosen to implement them will influence the extent to which they could be regarded as OECMs, and and there were also differences within country, as the Finnish study showed. And key determinants which we identified was the state of knowledge about the biodiversity and potential OECMs, the attitudes of land and water owners. I mean, in some cases, if the land was owned by the state, then it might be one person or one institution, you could talk to them. But in other cases, it was multiple land ownership. And one of the things about OECM recognition is landowners have to agree. So you might have a big negotiation process, and ultimately the ability to monitor changes in biodiversity. OECMs are based on effectiveness, and therefore it's assumed that you can monitor the biodiversity and be sure that it doesn't lose value over time. Next slide. We also did a couple of smaller studies. We looked at the state game husbandries in Bulgaria. It covered about 10% of the country, but as you can see, they're very general. If you can see from this slide, it's a bit unclear, but there's big areas of urban land within this state game husbandry. So the extent to whether that would become an OECM was really problematic, and it speaks to the fact that many land designations which come under conservation in Europe were set up a long time ago, before biodiversity became such a key element, and they don't necessarily match with today's biodiversity needs. Next slide, please. So one of the implications of that is that that we need to be quite careful in the way we apply OECMs. There's also a question that some protected areas were set up prior to biodiversity. They don't really have the same focus on biodiversity conservation that is in the case in other countries or other parts of the world, and some of those may actually be more close to OECMs. We haven't even really started the conversation yet about the implications of that, and whether protected areas might be redesignated as OECMs, what that would mean. In theory, it would make no difference because they both should be effective. In practice, would it mean that governments were giving them less attention, less political clout? We really don't know, but those are the kinds of things which we're going to have to investigate in the next few years. Lots of thinking to go on this. Next slide, please. So finally, where do we go? We found out that directives could be quite useful. They need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and it's going to be quite complicated. There are lots of questions that we haven't answered yet, and that's not just true of Europe, it's true all over the world. So there's an urgent need to raise awareness within the EU. There's lots of things which we need to still investigate. We proposed to the European Commission a roadmap of activities, both at institutional level and supported by the Commission at national level, to catalyze work on OECMs. Work's barely started, but there's lots of enthusiasm. We now have a slightly better picture of what we can do, and we're looking forward to the next slides, next stage in this. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much. Next slide.
Thank you, Nigel. Oh, what a beautiful row of trees that is. Next, we have Daniel Marnowick. Before I introduce Daniel, I want to encourage people to continue to put their questions into the Q&A section of the Zoom bar on the bottom. We're already getting some really interesting questions. I'm sure we'll get more, and we will save those until the end of these 4 presentations. Our next presenter is Daniel Marnowick. Daniel also has had quite a distinguished career in land conservation from a base in South Africa. He was formerly, if I recall correctly, with BirdLife South Africa, and has been a leader in identifying key biodiversity areas throughout Africa and Europe. He now works for the IUCN on the green list task, as I noted before, and is leading the way in terms of helping us understand how OECMs should be monitored over time. So Daniel will give us a presentation on developing a protocol for identifying and assessing OECMs in South Africa. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jim. I trust you can see my presentation in presentation mode. Good, thank you very much. So let me just start the timer so I don't run over. Right, my presentation is going to focus on a South African case study that we ran over 2018, 2019 with a number of partners and many of those partners are on this call now: Harry, Candice, Natasha Wilson. It was a partnership project, and what we aimed to do was to really test the then relatively new CBD definition of an OECM at a country level, within a country context. And so my presentation is primarily going to focus on the process. There have been a number of comments and concerns made around the validity of OECMs that are going to be reported, and how do we ensure that they really are OECMs delivering conservation outcomes. And so for me, the process around how we identify them at a national level is really important. And then the second half of my presentation will be a brief presentation of the results that we got from our case study assessments. So South Africa was one of the first countries to really test the OECM definition at a national level, and we had three primary goals of this project. It was really to firstly institutionalize OECMs within our national policy framework and practice framework, so that it really became a part of what was already there, and it wasn't seen as something that duplicated or replicated what we had in place, but rather supported and complemented. So part of that was then also to integrate OECMs into our existing landscape conservation sector by aligning and supporting and strengthening our existing community of practice. And then thirdly was to look at how we could use OECMs to enhance our existing efforts around conservation areas by, for instance, leveraging additional financing and resources, potentially underpinning the wildlife economy. But really the key objective was to undertake a comprehensive technical review that was actually undertaken by Candice Stevens on this call. And what we wanted to do was to look at national policy and legislation, how OECMs fitted into that, and then at the existing frameworks that we had nationally that recognized conservation areas. And for that, we needed to engage with the community of practice. So two key components was partnerships and stakeholder engagement. We developed key partnerships. Well, the primary partnership was between BirdLife South Africa and the IUCN. We then formed partnerships with two key government institutions, one being the South African National Biodiversity Institute, who is responsible for the expansion of our protected areas and conservation areas estate, and then the Department of Environment Affairs, who's ultimately responsible for reporting on our protected and conservation areas estate, both nationally and internationally. And then we had local role players, Kruger Canyons and Wilderness Foundation Africa. We also undertook extensive stakeholder engagement with the broader community of practice, because there were two main objectives. One is that we needed to make a strong case for OECMs, and so we needed to bring the community of practice along with us on this journey. But two is that we needed their inputs, the experts that we had in the country. It was fundamental to have their inputs into the design of the project, into how we aligned OECMs with our national frameworks, and how we identified potential OECMs in the landscape. So you can see we ran a number of national workshops and had a number of focal groups. So in terms of aligning OECMs with our national framework, the primary framework that we used and program that we used to declare protected areas, primarily privately protected areas, and identify conservation areas in the landscape is one called Biodiversity Stewardship, which is overseen by Stanby, but implemented by a broad community of practice made up of national, provincial governments and the NGO sector. And this table outlines the framework under biodiversity stewardship. You can see there are three categories. The first category are protected areas as defined by our National Environmental Protected Areas Act. So it's very clear where our protected areas are, and as Harry said, those wouldn't qualify as OECMs. But then we have category 2, which are recognized conservation areas. These are defined by contract law or property law or various parts of the Act. And there was a very clear alignment between category 2 conservation areas and OECMs. Then we have a category 3, which are looser designations known as partnership areas. And some of these may qualify as OECMs, which have to be assessed on a site-by-site basis, but many didn't. But what this exercise also allowed us to do was, in fact, to start identifying other land uses in the landscape that potentially qualified as OECMs, and thereby expand these lists, these categories under biodiversity stewardship. We then assessed these categories and land use types against the core characteristics of an OECM that we took from the CBD definition. And you'll see a very similar approach to the methodology that Harry referenced, that we're busy developing a global methodology. So we screened these sites against these 4 core characteristics and their elements. And then we took it to a site level and actually assessed case study sites against these through a questionnaire or an assessment tool that we developed for the purpose. Against these sites were graded or scored against a 3-grade rating scale. So the reason we have 3 grades, and particularly that grade in the middle, which is uncertain or partially, was to accommodate the variability that we would find in a landscape. You are never going to have clear yes and no's at all sites, because these aren't declared protected areas. We needed to accommodate that variability. So a site would score yes, it definitely meets that OECM characteristic, or no, it doesn't, or it potentially does, or we're not quite sure if it does, and therefore it would score an orange. What this also allowed us to do was to indicate to sites where they could strengthen aspects of their governance or aspects of their management in order to qualify or be recognized as an OECM. Now, to get into the results, we ran case study site assessments at 9 sites within the Kruger Canyons Biosphere Reserve. Of those 9 sites, 6 would be recognized as potential OECMs, constituting 60% of the area that we assessed. The 3 that didn't qualify, the 1 site fell a bit short in terms of the management. There wasn't a clear management plan, but they were willing to develop a management plan in order to be recognized. The other 2 sites were community sites where the governance or management just wasn't strong enough. Because of the landscape we selected, we knew the biodiversity value was very high, and so biodiversity value wasn't really in question. This is a map of the landscape we assessed. You can see the dark green areas are existing protected areas, and then the various colors are the sites that we assessed. And this just illustrates which qualified, which were uncertain, and which didn't. But what this map also shows us is how well OECMs can work in this type of landscape, where you can start mosaicing protected areas and OECMs can really fulfill that function of corridors, connectivity between protected areas. I'm now going to just briefly touch on 4 of the sites that we assessed that qualified as OECMs. And I just want to point out that these 4 sites previously weren't recognized under biodiversity stewardship as conservation areas. So essentially, this process has brought additional land use types into the fold under biodiversity stewardship, which adds massive value to that process. So the first site is a state-owned Air Force base. And again, you can see there by the map how well it slots in between protected areas, creating this connectivity and buffer. The site is managed by the South African National Defence Force. However, all state-owned land and infrastructure ultimately falls under the Department of Public Works, but specific government departments such as the Defence Force have custodianship over the management and governance. And in this case, the governance is underpinned by the South African National Defence Force Act of 2002. So in this case, there's obviously military infrastructure, and that wasn't assessed as an OECM, but the natural habitat around that infrastructure was assessed. And that is intact natural habitat that has a specific environmental management plan and has an environmental manager in place that implements that plan. The second site was an academic institute. This is a research facility that's owned and governed by a university. and is used for educational research purposes. The site is known as a knowledge hub for rural development, and it focuses on ecological and social research and training in the area. And again, you can see there that sort of light green area fits in between conservation areas and protected areas. The site is dedicated to research, so conservation is not its primary objective, but a secondary objective. But because it fits in so well with its research objectives in the area, habitat management is a core component of the site. The third site was one of the 3 community-owned sites that we assessed, and the only one that qualified. So the reason this site qualified is, like many other community sites, it's governed by a traditional authority, but that's strengthened by a community development forum and a farmers cooperative, which create platforms for community members to engage in the management and governance of the natural resources. The community has also entered into what's known as a conservation agreement with a local NGO called Conservation South Africa. This is an agreement that's signed for 3 to 5 years and renewed annually. And the agreement specifies the support that the conservation NGO gives to the community in terms of management advice, management implementation, and resource mobilization. So this is just a nice demonstration of how these private-public sector partnerships can assist these types of community sites to be recognized as OECMs by strengthening their governance and management capacity. And then the last site I'm going to talk about is another state-owned site. This is a state-owned commercial forestry site. Now, normally, commercial forestry sites wouldn't be recognized as OECMs because the habitat has been changed. But in this case, because this there's a vast extent of wetlands and grasslands that flow through this site that's actively managed for its biodiversity value, it would qualify. And so only the intact natural habitat was actually assessed as an OECM. And again, you can see the role it plays in terms of connecting landscapes. So I think my time is almost out, and this is my last slide to just briefly touch on some of the strengths and weaknesses of the OECM process that we discovered in our study in South Africa. First, that the OECM framework is going to facilitate the formalization, expansion, and reporting of our conservation areas in South Africa, particularly to the CBD. Second, that OECMs has an important role to play in interconnected landscapes and seascapes, and the maps illustrate how important it is in these mosaic landscapes connecting protected areas. Third, OECMs include a diverse range of right holders that contribute to area-based conservation, including groups that were previously marginalized or not recognized in the conservation estate. Fourth, OECMs play a role or potentially play a role in supporting local economies, and particularly in the African context, to underpin the role of communities in the wildlife economy. Of course, there are challenges. A significant challenge is leveraging the financial and human resources that are going to be required to assess these sites and report on these sites without diverting resources away from other conservation priorities, such as protected areas. And that's my last slide, Jim.
Thank you, Daniel.
Just to say, there is a South African report, and I am going to post the link to that report in the chat box.
Great. I want to emphasize 4 words that Daniel used at the end of his presentation, which is to assess, report, monitor, and support. All of those things are necessary if we are to achieve large landscape conservation that is durable over decades and centuries. So this is a very encouraging development that the IUCN is undertaking this in such a comprehensive way. And Daniel, thank you for pointing that out. Our next speaker is Clara Matallana Tobon. Clara is in Colombia. I believe that she was formerly associated with the Alexander Humboldt Biological Resources Institute, which I believe is based in Colombia. And she is now affiliated with the IUCN and deeply involved in the specialist group that is thinking about OECMs. So Cara, please take the virtual stage.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you everybody for inviting me to present the case of Colombia. I'm going to share my slides. So today I'm going to talk about what have we been doing in Colombia regarding OECMs and the role that these strategies could have in nature conservation in our country. I'm Clara Matallana. I'm a member of the OECM specialist group. I work with the Humboldt Institute until some weeks ago. So now I'm an independent consultant, but I'm still working with this topic of OECMs. So what I want to share with you today is that Colombia is considered a mega diverse country. We have many species registered. We are #1 in birds and other groups. And also we have a huge diversity of cultural ethnic groups. And that's why we have a very different and rich cultural background in the country. So this is actually the current protected area system of Colombia. We have more than 1,000 protected areas that were very close to meet the Aichi target 11. Those areas are mainly with governance by the state and governance like a private governance and a shared governance. And also it's important to say that this protected area system is very well consolidated, but there are some issues that we have to work to improve the connectivity and the representativeness of these protected areas. So as I mentioned, Colombia has a very rich cultural background. We have indigenous reserves, Afro-Colombian territories, also farmer reserves. And there we have identified more than 1,000 sites that could be conservation strategies. That's why we believe that the OECM framework was an opportunity to identify and analyze which of these areas have a positive conservation outcome and fulfill these gaps of connectivity, representativeness, and other aspects that this protected area system will need to achieve. So this wide diversity of conservation strategies are run by different stakeholders, such as indigenous communities, also Afro-Colombian local communities, and also we have some in public lands and run by NGOs and also by private sectors. So there is a very big range of these type of conservation strategies that are very extended in the country. So that's why with some organizations here in Colombia that have a long experience on conservation strategies, we joined together to have this project to apply the OECM criteria in Colombia. This project was founded by the small grant program of the GEF, and we could apply the OECM criteria to some potential cases in Colombia. So these are the organizations that are involved in this project, and what the project objectives were to identify these potential OECMs, to analyze and apply the criteria with right holders of each of the cases, analyze the information and identify some aspect that needs to be strengthened to meet the OECM criteria. And the third objective was to report these cases to the WCMC database of OECMs. So what we did at first was to select some cases with the databases that we had and the knowledge that we have in these different organizations. So we were able to identify some of those cases, ensuring that they were not already recognized as protected areas, and with the notion that they met the essential characteristic of the definition of the OECM criteria. So we identify from this whole range of areas of potential areas that we have, we work with 27 cases. These cases had a different kind of governance, governance by the state, shared governance, private governance, and also governance by indigenous people and local communities. So we have a different range of type of cases that we could analyze. To analyzing if the areas met with the OECM criteria, we make our own methodology using some questions related to each of the criterion. So this is an example of the question that we use to analyze if each of the cases, for example, for the criteria A and B. So we make some questions and then we went to some workshops with the representatives of these 27 cases, and we work with them to answer each of the questions related to each of the criteria. So we work with results, and at the end we have a self-rating system to see if the area met with the criteria. So it was very interesting because the representatives of each area analyzed which of the criteria they will need to strengthen to meet the criteria and be recognized as an OECM. So I have 3 examples that we run of these 27 cases, and it shows the different types of conservation strategies that we have in Colombia, and we focus on community and local run strategies. So for example, this is one that is located in the Caribbean coast, in one mountain range that is called Montes de Maria, and it was a zone that was very affected by the armed conflict here in Colombia. So they have an organization, an association of women, and they are protecting the area because there is an area of a dry forest. The dry forest in Colombia was very affected some years ago, and we only have a remaining of the 10% of the original ecosystem. So this security and protection of their watershed. So they said that they set aside one area for conservation because they are sure that this area is needed to have the water and to their food security. So in this case, for example, we find that this is a potential OECM, that it could be strengthened in a way because they have some threats, like they don't own the land. This is an issue that is very extended in Colombia. We don't have a very clear land tenure in many parts of the country. But in this case, we find out that they have 30 hectares for conservation that could be an OECM. And they have some motivations as the vindication of the women's rights for food production and the sustainable production of their crops. Also, we have another case that we analyze, and this is a reserve, an indigenous reserve that is located in the department of Nariño. Is it at south of Colombia? And in this case, this is an indigenous reserve that set aside one part of this reserve only for conservation purposes. So we have more than 1,000 hectares that are for conservation of the tropical forest. This area is very important because it's considered a hotspot for biodiversity. This area only have like 200 species of birds, so it has a very big importance for biodiversity. What they do is was the same. They analyze each of the criteria, and we said which of them will need to have a strengthening to meet with the OECM criteria. So for example, this was a good case, but they established that maybe the governance and the participation of the community needs some strengthening to meet with the criteria. Then the next case that we analyzed is this non-industrial fishing zone that is located in the Pacific coast of Colombia. Is from an Afro-Colombian community that established that it was important not to have this industrial fishing to have a food security for all the local fishermen that inhabit this part of the coast. And the third objective that we had with this project was reporting. So for doing that, we established a reporting route with the Ministry of Environment following the WCMC guidelines to make these strategies more visible, to recognize these strategies and the actors beyond protected areas here in the country and include them on regional planning, and also to have the opportunity to have some fundraising and capacity building in this area. So we right now, we doesn't have as a country any OECM reported, but we expect to have some very, very soon with the analysis we did in these cases. So as conclusions of this analysis and this project, we find that the OECM framework allows to recognize other forms of conservation and governance that are happening already in the country, and that complement the conservation system of the protected areas. Also, we know that we need capacity building to apply the OECM criteria in a bigger scale, because this has to be applied case by case. So it's important to have this capacity. We think that national authorities should be involved in the discussion on how to apply these criteria, not only national, but also regional authorities, to have these criteria better applied to every cases. Also, more resources will be needed to identify, monitor, and report the OECMs, because we have a wide range of strategies, and we need to analyze if they meet the criteria, and we will need to demonstrate that they have a biodiversity value. So we may need some participative monitoring methodologies to find out that these areas are protecting biodiversity. And also, but they are a very good opportunity to increase the connectivity, effectiveness, and climate change adaptation of the current protected area systems, and also will be a key to the biodiversity framework of the post-2020 and the goals that are being set of the 30% protected on all the countries. So that was my presentation. I want to show you the team of the project. We are part of very different organizations, and thank you very much for hearing my presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. That's very interesting to learn how this system of analysis and monitoring is evolving over time. I think that's the implication that I take away from what you're talking about, and that I think there's a significant amount of learning that's going on even as we speak. Now I want to invite all of the panelists to make yourselves available. That means Harry, Nigel, Daniel, Cara, Tillman, if you're still here, as well as Heather Bingham from UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center in England, Candace Stevens, our green finance innovator, working with Wilderness Foundation Africa in South Africa, and Lisa McLaughlin, who is the Vice President of Conservation Policy and Practice for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So I'm going to ask, our panelists have been very, very diligent about answering all the questions asked as they come up on the screen. I'm going to re-ask a couple of them so that we can have a discussion on this. The first two questions come from James Deutsch, and I want to see if I can manipulate these questions in such a way that I can actually get to them. His first question is, if protected areas are defined by objective, primarily being nature conservation, and OECMs by outcome, that is effective conservation, and given that many existing protected areas are not delivering sustained positive conservation outcomes, this leads to the paradox that correctly applied, the OECM designation is a better guarantor of effective conservation than PA designation. Is that correct? And then he asks another question that's a very complicated but interesting question. And then he asks, will unsuccessful OECMs be struck off the list? That is there an opportunity for review over time of the effectiveness of these measures? And will unsuccessful protected areas remain on the list? So he's really asking two large questions. That is there a contrast in the standard used for PAs and OECMs that lead to different outcomes, sometimes paradoxically different outcomes? And two is, in the future, will these areas, both protected areas and OECMs, come up for further review so that we can be sure that over the span of decades and centuries, they are indeed protecting biodiversity? Who wants to take a shot at that interesting set of questions?
Can I open up and then and hand over? You know, just from the inception of this work, the issue which has just been raised really goes to the heart of it. The first thing to underscore is that the PA framework is supremely useful for enabling and giving recognition to governance authorities who decide that they would like to set aside lands, and in other contexts, marine areas as well, for conservation. And sometimes those kinds of you know, PAs can take years to pay off, to actually become effective. And of course, there's climate change. There are other many different influences on land and marine areas that might lead to those areas being ineffective at one or other time. And so again, that PA framework is supremely useful. The way that has been crafted is very important. I think what's happened is that particularly people who are highly imbued in the PA world, understandably, I understand that, are skeptical in the first instance of this newfangled approach to thinking about you know, this designation. And that is why I put the CBD criteria, and I spoke to that. Daniel and other you know, speakers set out what the criteria is. When you look at that criteria, it's really clear that the CBD is saying these areas must deliver the long-term conservation of biodiversity. And and as stated in the question, if that is the case, then 100% of OECMs should be delivering these long-term outcomes. Not all PAs have to. And when you start nuancing that thinking, that's acceptable, because that's the way we're kind of thinking about this. We need to then work extremely hard, and I will choose my words carefully, to make sure that PAs are not paper PAs, and that management effectiveness is being improved upon, and the status quo of ineffective PAs is not accepted. And in the one of the answers as well, I posted that the CBD decision is very clear as well, that monitoring must take place. And I at least feel that yes, ineffective OECMs, as in OECMs should be monitored, they should be monitored regularly. And where OECMs are seen not to be effective for one or other reason, even if it is in the fault of the governance authorities, then those OECMs, then those areas should not be reported as OECMs at that time. And so that's something we're trying to work out at the moment. Thanks very much.
Anyone else want to take a swing at that set of questions? Nigel?
Very
Nigel,
briefly, and yep, very briefly, and in response to Harry, I mean, since 2008, what was then the new definition of a protected area actually does have effectiveness within it. So, strictly speaking, an area doesn't meet its definition if it's ineffective. In practice, no government has ever de-designated a protected area because it's ineffective. And my concern is that, or my suspicion is that governments will be very wary about de-designating OECMs for exactly the same reason. So I think effectiveness is going to be a key element that we need to focus on in both protected areas and OECMs over the next few years.
All right. I have a question that was asked by John Kerr. Where is the balance between states and their agencies seeking out and identifying OECMs? That is a top-down designation approach, compared with landowners and communities, and I will add NGOs, proposing areas as OECMs and, for that matter, PAs. So how do we balance the different sources of information or expertise that might be recommending that a particular geographic area receive PA or OECM designation? And Heather, I was hoping you were going to raise your hand. Go ahead.
Sure. So in terms of reporting data to the databases, there's kind of a range of ways in which this can happen, but the most frequent is that the data comes from the national government. And often that's actually the most straightforward way. So for countries that are considering starting a process of identifying and reporting OECMs, probably the recommended way is for governments to work together with multiple other stakeholders. So to work with the NGOs, work with the private landowners and the indigenous peoples and communities to collectively identify what OECMs mean for the country and to map those with the consent of the people who are actually managing them on the ground. And then for the data to come through the national government. But maybe others want to add to that.
I'm scanning my screen and not seeing anyone else. Lisa.
Yeah, Jim, I would say just to build on Heather's point. So in Canada, we've designed a decision support tool, which can be filled out by NGOs, by private landowners or the state to help the applicant identify whether or not the lands should qualify or do qualify as an OECM, a protected area, or neither. And so working with the state agency, kind of come to a conclusion on that. So while the state actually submits to the World Database, we're trying to work jointly with the private landowners as well as the public agencies to determine whether or not they meet the criteria. So that's another way to keep that process moving.
Heather, can I ask you to elaborate just a little bit more? My perception is that over time, that the center has been increasingly receptive to information that comes from governments, perhaps, but that comes from other sources than it began to be, because it started, as I understand it, as a place that really was set up to receive information from governments, and the others needed to exclusively go through their governments. Is that true that over time there have been various accommodations so that governments at least were able to report, more easily report NGO and community information?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, there's kind of a number of ways in which reporting happens. And the primary data providers, I'm sorry, there's a cat. The primary data providers are still the governments in most cases. So particularly for indigenous peoples and local communities, we have ways in which they can report directly. Often that involves the government, but in other cases it can involve a kind of peer review process where the data is reviewed by other indigenous peoples and communities. So there are a few different ways in which it can happen. But I guess what I would say is where countries are considering beginning this kind of process, then it really is, in a lot of cases, very beneficial for all parties to kind of work together.
Great, thank you very much. Karagu Mwangi asks in several questions, where can we find additional case studies that give us information about the OECM process? And I would add to that question, are there plans now for additional studies going forward that will further refine the OECM process, report out on lessons learned, and make recommendations on where we go from here? I see no hands.
Maybe I can that again.
Okay,
Yep.
Go ahead, Harry. Yeah.
Yes, so here is the, this is the chat. Here is the, at least this is the IECN WCPA group that's working sort of, I'd say a global and across terrestrial and marine realms. On that website, you'll find case studies, you'll find guidelines, the draft methodology, a whole range of other things there. And at the same time, what I'm expecting and actually welcoming as well is that sectors and different governance groups and even, and regions and countries are going to draw on CBD decision 14.8 that, as I've said, I'm a big fan of, and say, how can we make this work for ourselves? So we as the WCPA group are trying to develop the most generic, broadly applicable advice and guidance methodologies possible. And at the same time, we are already seeing, certainly in the marine realm, the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, working to develop guidance for the fisheries sector, marine capture fisheries, and other sectors and groups will follow suit. And so actually an invitation to any of you on this call, if this, clearly from the Q&A that we have been furiously trying to answer, if this resonates, go through the organizers, ideally, or come to us, and we'd love to take some of these conversations forwards. And as you've seen, and as Jim was mentioning in the introduction, things are moving quite quickly, from in terms of the number of OECMs that are coming through, the countries from which they're coming through, the biomes and the governance authorities. And so again, an invitation to any of you who've got spare time or spare research funds or whatever it may be, if this seems like, this is an area which is moving quite quickly, and we welcome, you to get involved and think these things out. And in terms of my last slide, target 2, if and when that 30 by 30 target is agreed, we're going to see, a real, an exponential engagement across the world on OECM. So really, the questions that you're asking are not, I always think in these Q&As, it sounds like the questions are asked and some experts provide answers. The honest truth, the most honest way to engage this interaction is to say there are many, many questions and issues that still need to be discussed and worked out. And all the questions that have been asked today are valid and cannot just be simply answered, but lead to further exploration and require further engagement. So that's really an invitation to all of you to get involved in this going forwards, and to bring, because OECMs engage areas and areas of expertise that already exist. It's not a sort of a new thing. It is a where is my expertise useful in this global conversation? And so that's one way to kind of frame this. Thanks.
Okay, Tillman, please.
Yeah, I just want to comment on some of the previous questions, kind of circle back to the distinction between protected areas and OECMs, and the question of whether the focus on outcomes instead of on the objectives for setting up a PA kind of change the way that those might be registered or reviewed and so forth. And I think that it may be helpful actually to, the discussion that is now evolving around OECMs to also apply that a little bit to the protected areas. The question of what is an effective management, how do we define the outcomes, what is good reporting, what does good reporting look like, how do we incentivize compatible land uses and so forth. So it kind of gives us also the chance to refocus the questions that protected areas also, that need to be answered with regard to protected areas also. And I certainly hope that the focus on the outcomes will help us lead the way here. I caution against narrowing down the discussion about OECMs to their potential contribution to the 30 by 30 target. There are other issues as well where OECMs will hopefully play a role. Connectivity is one. As I said, building good incentive structures, discussing what outcomes should look like and how those should be monitored and reported. All that applies as well. So yeah, that's just my takeaway from today, that all of these open questions are very fascinating. I welcome the discussion. And I think we need to be critical, but also, I sense a certain opportunity to broaden that discussion and refocus going forward on the conservation outcomes. And that is certainly the contribution of the OECMs that is already happening in the discussion.
I have two hands raised. I see Clara wants to say something, and then Heather.
Yes, thank you, Jim. I wanted to emphasize on some lessons learned in the process in Colombia, because I know there is some things that we have to strengthen in this framework of the OECM. So what we find when we were applying the criteria, that is very important to have this capacity building to analyze the governance of the sites, because maybe in some places is the first time you talk about governance and you analyze how is the community or the other stakeholders organized and how they make the decisions to conserve this area. So we think it's an important point. Maybe we can work together to have more capacity built in this aspect for the applying the criteria. Also, we find that to analyze the positive outcomes is very important. For example, in Colombia, we have some sites that doesn't have any, for example, the inventory of the species and ecosystems. So it's important to work this with the communities to know which species are in this site and what are the conservation outcomes. And also this is related to effectiveness. So if we want to apply some tool like, for example, the green list that has been applied to protected area or other tool, we will also need a capacity building for apply these indicators and criteria to see if those areas are being effective in protecting the biodiversity. Thank you.
All right, Heather, I'm going to call on you, and then one more question, then we're going to have to close the session. So, Heather.
I'll be brief. I kind of just wanted to build on Tilman's point, really, in saying that I feel like a lot of the questions that have come in today have kind of hinged on this idea of whether we're focusing on coverage or whether we're focusing on quality. And by quality, I mean quality of both OECMs and PAs. And I'm kind of encompassing effective management, but also biodiversity outcomes and good governance and equitable governance. And all of these things are kind of where we really need to shift over the next 10 years, which is one of the key messages of the Protected Planet report that came out last week. And it's something that the Protected Planet Initiative, which is where all these areas are recorded, it's something we want to focus on much, much more over the next few years. So really moving away from just saying this is where protected areas and OECMs are, to saying how well they're performing.
Great. I agree and understand that. I think that's a very important point. So the last question I'm going to ask today, and I apologize to all the great questions that I haven't been able to bring up, it comes from Katarina Kuhner, who asks, have you considered the designation of sacred forests, sacred groves, church forests, and the like as OECMs? And let's see.
Yeah, we have very much. The Ethiopian church forest being a great example of something that we're working with at the moment, but absolutely. And again, it's really interesting. That was my kind of segue to OECMs. So yes, to the question at hand, yes, absolutely. But the broader point that Heather's just made in terms of being the ultimate aim, and then the question is, well, what are all these different areas governed by all sorts of different governance types and sectors and others as well. You know, there's a lot of bad news in this world, and OECMs is one means by which to kind of explore some good news stories of places that are thriving under difficult circumstances.
Well said, and a very nice way to close this out. I want to thank all of the panelists who have taken so much time to prepare and to offer a really in-depth view of an emerging topic that's going to be important for conservation for many, many years to come. So thank you so much for bringing this to our attention, for giving such great presentations. Thank you to all of the people who have participated from all around the world. I want to send out a special thank you to Robin Austin, who tirelessly monitors all the technical details of these webinars and makes sure that we're all doing the right thing at the right time. So thank you, Robin, for another great job on that. And thank you to this entire community for achieving what appears to be 17% in the Aichi protocols. And we're on to Kunming and the next giant step. So with that, we will close. Thanks to you all, and we will see you soon again with another webinar from the ILCN and the European Land Conservation Network. Good day to you all.